The maternity ward smelled of antiseptic and quiet hope, the kind of place where time slowed and emotions ran high. Outside the pale blue doors, nurses moved with practiced calm, but inside one room the air was tight with tension. The young woman lay propped against white pillows, exhausted yet glowing with the fragile joy of new motherhood. Her baby slept in a clear bassinet nearby, chest rising and falling in tiny, determined breaths. This should have been a moment of peace. Instead, it had become a battlefield. Her mother-in-law stood rigid at the foot of the bed, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes sharp with judgment. She spoke in clipped phrases, her voice low but cutting, accusing the young woman of ingratitude, of weakness, of somehow failing expectations that had never been clearly spoken. She insisted that the baby should be taken home immediately, that the hospital was unnecessary, that traditions were being ignored. When the daughter-in-law tried to respond, her voice trembled, not from fear alone but from the shock of being attacked at her most vulnerable moment. The words, "You don't belong here," hung in the air like a slap. The nurses sensed the storm but hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. Family conflicts were not uncommon, yet something about this confrontation felt cruelly personal. The mother-in-law moved closer, pointing toward the door as if to physically expel the woman from the room. "You've caused enough trouble," she said. "If you had any dignity, you'd leave." The daughter-in-law's eyes filled with tears, her hand instinctively reaching toward the bassinet, protective and desperate. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Then the door opened. At first, no one spoke. A man stepped inside, tall and composed, his presence immediately shifting the balance of the room. He wasn't loud or dramatic, but there was authority in the way he stood, the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly why he was there. The mother-in-law turned, ready to continue her tirade, and froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Recognition washed over her face, followed by disbelief. The man spoke calmly, addressing the nurses first, thanking them for their care. Then he turned to the young mother, asking gently how she was feeling. His tone carried respect and warmth, the kind that reassures without pity. Finally, he faced the mother-in-law. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply stated the facts. The young woman was under medical care, she had every right to be there, and no one would force her to leave. If there was a problem, it would be handled by hospital administration. The mother-in-law tried to respond, but her confidence had evaporated. The words she'd wielded so easily moments before now refused to form. In that silence, the power she thought she held dissolved. The daughter-in-law exhaled, a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time since the confrontation began, she felt seen and protected. Later, as the room settled into calm, the phrase echoed in her mind, "You're rushing to the wrong station." It felt like a strange but fitting metaphor. So many people barreled through life convinced they were right, certain they knew where everyone else should be headed, never stopping to question whether they themselves were on the correct path. The mother-in-law had been so focused on control that she'd missed the point entirely. This was not about tradition or pride, but about care, compassion, and a fragile new life. Across the country, a different kind of confrontation was playing out under bright studio lights. Mark Harmon sat on the set of Good Morning America, hands folded, posture steady. Known for his measured demeanor and long career built on professionalism, he appeared relaxed at first. Michael Strahan smiled for the cameras, questions flowing easily, but as the interview progressed, the tone shifted. What began as light conversation edged into uncomfortable territory. Strahan pressed on topics Harmon had clearly signaled he didn't want to explore, framing questions in ways that felt less curious and more provocative. There was an awkward pause after one particularly pointed remark, the kind that makes viewers at home lean closer to the screen. Harmon's expression changed, not anger, but disappointment. He answered briefly, steering the conversation back toward his work, but the pressure continued. The audience could sense it. This was no longer a friendly exchange. It felt like a test, and Harmon was being pushed to react. Finally, after another intrusive question, he stopped. He looked directly at Strahan, thanked him for the time, and stood up. There was no shouting, no theatrics. He simply walked off the set, leaving behind stunned hosts in a room full of unspoken questions. The moment went viral within hours. Some called it dramatic, others praised Harmon for setting boundaries. In an industry that often rewards oversharing and public discomfort, his quiet exit felt like a statement. You don't have to endure humiliation for the sake of entertainment. You don't have to stay on a path that feels wrong just because someone else insists it's the right one. In an unexpected way, the two scenes mirrored each other. In the hospital room and on the television set, power dynamics were challenged. In both cases, someone tried to dominate the narrative, to dictate terms without regard for dignity. And in both cases, the situation shifted not through shouting or aggression, but through calm refusal. A door opening, a chair pushed back, a boundary drawn. The daughter-in-law would later remember that day not only for the fear, but for the relief that followed. She learned that vulnerability did not mean powerlessness, and that help can arrive when least expected. The mother-in-law, forced into silence, confronted a truth she'd avoided: control is not the same as care. And somewhere between those realizations, a new understanding began to form, fragile but real. As for Harmon, his walk-off became a quiet lesson in self-respect. Interviews would continue, questions would be asked, but that moment stood as a reminder that dignity is not negotiable. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up, walk away, and refuse to play a role that diminishes you. Life is full of stations, departures, and arrivals. People rush, convinced they're late, convinced they know the route. But every so often, a moment forces a pause, a sudden guest, an unanswered question, an empty chair. And in that pause, clarity emerges. Maybe the destination was wrong all along. Maybe the real journey begins the moment you choose to stop. The corridor outside the maternity ward was quiet, broken only by the distant hum of machines and the soft squeak of nurses' shoes against polished floors. Inside one room, however, emotions were boiling over. The young woman had barely recovered from childbirth. Her body ached, her mind swirled with exhaustion, fear, and wonder, all tangled together. She watched her newborn sleeping beside her, a tiny miracle wrapped in a blanket, and tried to focus on that fragile peace. But peace was the one thing she was not being allowed to have. Her mother-in-law stood like a judge delivering a sentence. Every word she spoke carried years of resentment, unspoken comparisons, and rigid expectations. She accused the young mother of disrespecting family customs, of embarrassing the family by staying in the hospital longer than necessary, of being too weak to handle motherhood the proper way. Each sentence landed heavily, as if meant to crush rather than correct. The daughter-in-law tried to explain that the doctors had advised rest, that the baby needed monitoring, that she herself was not yet strong. But explanations were not what the older woman wanted. She wanted obedience. "You should leave," she said coldly, pointing toward the door. "You're not doing anyone any good here." Those words cut deeper than the physical pain of childbirth. To be told to leave, not just a room but a moment that should have belonged to her, felt like being erased. Tears welled in her eyes, not dramatic, not loud, just quiet and heavy. She felt small, trapped between her love for her child and the authority of someone who seemed determined to assert dominance at any cost. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances. Hospital policy was clear, but family pressure often complicated things. Before anyone could step in, the door opened. The man who entered did not rush. His movements were measured, his presence calm yet unmistakably firm. He greeted the staff politely, then turned his attention to the young mother. He asked if she was comfortable, if she needed anything, if the baby was feeding well. His voice was steady, respectful, human. For the first time since the confrontation began, the daughter-in-law felt like a person rather than a problem. When he finally looked at the mother-in-law, something shifted. The woman who had been so forceful moments earlier suddenly seemed uncertain. She recognized him immediately, not just his face, but what he represented. Authority. Consequences. Boundaries that could not be crossed without repercussion. Her mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. "This patient is under our care," the man said calmly. "No one is being forced to leave. If there are concerns, they can be discussed respectfully. Otherwise, this visit is over." There was no shouting, no humiliation. Just a clear line drawn in unmistakable terms. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. The mother-in-law lowered her gaze, her power slipping away in the face of quiet resolve. She stepped back, suddenly aware that she was no longer in control. Later, when the room returned to stillness, the daughter-in-law replayed the moment in her mind. One thought echoed again and again: "You're rushing to the wrong station." It felt symbolic, almost poetic. The mother-in-law had been so obsessed with enforcing her version of family honor that she'd lost sight of compassion. She was racing toward an outcome that brought no dignity, no love, only division. And for the young mother, the realization was equally powerful. She didn't have to follow someone else's timetable or destination. Her journey, her recovery, her motherhood would move at its own pace. Far from that hospital, under studio lights and rolling cameras, another confrontation unfolded, though it looked very different on the surface. Mark Harmon sat across from Michael Strahan, prepared for what was supposed to be a routine interview. He had done hundreds over the course of his career. He knew the rhythm, the give and take, the balance between promotion and personality. At first, everything seemed normal. Smiles, polite laughter, a few anecdotes for the audience. Then the questions shifted. Strahan pressed into areas Harmon had deliberately kept private. The tone became sharper, less curious and more probing. Each question seemed designed to unsettle, to provoke a reaction rather than reveal insight. Harmon answered briefly, redirecting where he could, maintaining professionalism. But the tension was visible. The air thickened, the smiles strained. One question crossed an invisible line. It wasn't scandalous on its own, but it carried an edge of disrespect, as if Harmon's boundaries were a challenge rather than a signal. There was a pause. Harmon looked at Strahan, then glanced briefly off camera, as if weighing his options. He could deflect again. He could joke it away. He could play along for the sake of the show. Instead, he chose something rarer. He thanked Strahan calmly, stood up, and walked off the set. There was no explosion, no dramatic speech. The power of the moment lay in its restraint. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the stunned expressions left behind. Viewers at home felt the shift immediately. This was not a tantrum. It was a refusal. A refusal to be diminished, to be used for uncomfortable spectacle. The reaction was swift and divided. Some criticized Harmon for being overly sensitive. Others applauded him for drawing a line in an industry that often rewards discomfort. But beneath the debate was a simple truth: dignity matters. And sometimes the most powerful statement is knowing when to leave. The parallel between the hospital room and the television studio was striking. In both places, someone attempted to assert control by pushing limits. In both places, the situation changed not through aggression, but through calm authority and self-respect. A door opening, a chair left empty, silence where intimidation once lived. For the daughter-in-law, that day became a turning point. She would remember the fear, yes, but more than that, she would remember the relief. The knowledge that she was allowed to take up space, even in her most vulnerable state. That motherhood did not require submission to cruelty disguised as tradition. For Harmon, the walk-off became part of a larger conversation about boundaries in public life. It reminded people that even under bright lights and public scrutiny, one has the right to say enough. You are not obligated to stay where respect is absent. Life often presents moments when we are pushed toward destinations chosen by others. Expectations, traditions, ratings, appearances. We rush, thinking we must arrive on time, afraid of what will happen if we don't. But sometimes a moment interrupts that momentum. A sudden guest, an uncomfortable question, a quiet decision to stand or walk away. And in that interruption, clarity appears. You realize that not every train deserves your ticket. Not every station is meant to be your stop. Sometimes, the bravest act is slowing down, reassessing, and choosing a different direction entirely.